behalf. Today we have with us Professor P Sanjay, and he will be talking about studying comparative media systems, conceptual and methodological issues in researching the BRICS media system. Professor Sanjay teaches at the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, and has held several positions of import in the university, like the Director, College of Integrated Studies, and the Pro Vice-chancellor. His academic training in communication and journalism was in Bangalore and later at the Simon Fraser University, Canada. He was involved in studying the historic satellite instructional television experiment, and his professional expertise and interests are in the areas of political economy as information and communication technologies, development communication, and international communication. He taught at the University of Madras and MS University, Tirunelveli, as well as he was the director of the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, Delhi, and the first Vice-chancellor of Central University of Tamil Nadu. He's been associated with various national and international bodies that chalk out policies on media education and research. His talk today is based on his work for the edited volume BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order by Dayakishan Tusu and Caroline Nordenstein. He's prepared a reading list for us, and we'll be sharing the link along with a link to the edited volume shortly. Hello, Sanjay sir. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Devina. Thank you, Pranay, and thanks to the RRTO team and the faculty for inviting me to this, round table. My focus today will be on the BRICS media system, however problematic it is in terms of the present geopolitical equations. It's also based on the work that we did as part of a multinational project led by Carle at the University of Tampere in Finland. During the course of the project, which ran for about 4 years, and the residual work is still going on, we had debated and discussed many aspects, and probably in the presentation, a few of them will come up as I go through the presentation. This, of course, is a general knowledge wiki kind of a slide which talks about the importance, both in terms of sheer numbers, as in population, and also the World Bank, IMF kind of economic equations as to where we stand in terms of GDP, etc., etc. So even the staunch critique of such systems like Thiruvarur have, as late as 2016, accepted the BRICS as some kind of emerging formation worthy of recognition. And now, when we talk about either the media system or structures, it is not to say that this is something very radical or new. Always post World War II and the formation of many nations, some kind of a comparison now and then occurs, in our discussion. And since we are all biased towards media and communication studies, of course, that bias gets reflected in what we do with regard to the media system. Now, the immediate memory of scholars when we talk about media systems or its comparison would be, of course, the landmark work of Helen and Mancini. But there are certain, precursors to the approach. One of that, as many observers feel, is the kind of the four theories of the press, and This, of course, also was highly critiqued in terms of trying to slot the countries and into different blocks. For example, the distinction between, let us say, the authoritarian model and the Soviet communist model has always been a contentious kind of a discourse, at least among the scholarship in rest of the world. Nevertheless, in terms of research traditions, media system, some of these works need to be recognized, whatever be their orientation and critique. Is comparison needed? Is comparison, important? It is something that we very often ask, but all over the world, comparative approaches, be it politics, be it economics, be it governance system, have come to stay, and now and then we get indexes of where we are, etc., etc. Now, in terms of the BRICS project itself, we tried. I mean, Kale and the team, which led us, did try to kind of, make the system approach not necessarily as frozen in stone, but they decided to call it as something that is in a state of flux, and as it is continuously evolving, and thereby lending itself a bit of openness, where the resident scholars and the contributors could think of some kind of differences. But nevertheless, all funding projects or all projects on a world scale which come together will have certain imperatives, and that is something that researchers cannot avoid. The best thing is to stay autonomous and do your own work, but when you are part of the comparative system, I think certain imperatives do come in. The project did agonize, like, for example, the theoretical concepts of media systems and the role of media and journalists in democracy. Now, this democracy concept has been a constant rallying point, from the days of UNESCO's minimum mass media norms to even its latest report amidst the COVID-19, where democracy seems to be a very kind of, what should I say, overwhelming defining variable. So, role of media, I mean, is something that they talk, assuming that some kind of democracy, acceptable or not, exists in different parts of the world. Then, of course, the distinction between freedom and independence of media is attempted, probably inspired by freedom for its own sake, and the post-liberalization analysis of media structures, where you may have freedom to shout and scream, but the gatekeepers might not necessarily have the independence to allow your shouting and screaming to go ahead. I mean, this is something that many scholars have understood. And then, of course, certain labeled aspects do come in, like citizen journalism, etc., etc. Now, the reason why I'm trying to mention all this is that the BRICS project was not necessarily about a structure or a system. During its 4 years, it put out more than 20 to 25 different kinds of publications touching upon system, profession, ethics, journalism, education, and so on and so on. So, from that point of view, it's comprehensive and did not fit into the kind of table that we normally expect such comparative studies to, attempt. The critique of Masoni is that it is Western, and in the context of BRICS, Um, are we Western? Are we non-Western? I don't know. I mean, this non-Western and de-Westernization is a kind of lingering, concept that emerges now and then, and sometimes we as scholars try to footnote it and try to explain, where we are. In terms of the team, Colin Sparks, who has been an avid China watcher, uh, does seem to have a very subtle, understanding, and doesn't want to kind of, say that media system analysis is either definitive. He would like to retain its openness. But we had one problem in terms of the axis of comparison, that is both Russia and China. Historically, as many of us would remember, even in terms of worldwide analysis, the tag that they carried as communist or socialist, and the fact that freedom or democracy was not there, uh, they were not kind of in the reckoning in terms of the other kind of analysis which we were making, which was by and large rooted in the notion of what liberal democracies, as defined by anyone, probably the North American context or the European context, but definitely. But in this project, Russia and China, for the BRICS reason, did come in, and this is where the work of Elena Vartanova and Yuzhitsi in China, where they try to look at the glasnost and also the Chinese rise of economic power, and introduce certain notions of the spread of media and the so-called pluralism that is embedded, rather than dismissing it as some kind of a monolithic, communist kind of a situation. Whereas scholars from India, Brazil, and South Africa, there was a different kind of questions that we had. Some form of direct colonization, in these three countries. More recently, South African scholars also are trying to define the apartheid in terms of the colonial construct and doing some work in that. So we were kind of thought that we had a, a, a fairly different way of looking at things, and that is one of the reasons why we had to constantly say that that is possible, that is not possible, etc., etc. This led the team to accept that is there some kind of a common framework we could respond, and we could then go on to the analysis, which is country specific. So this is some kind of a, what should I say, research team's methodological dilemma that we had during the course of the initial formulation. Now, media landscapes, mediascapes, or whatever you call it, how valid it is to be media centric in our approach is a larger philosophical question. But having accepted the limits of the discipline, we tend to look at it. Now, if you look at the spread of the app here, which is colored to highlight the you know BRICS formation, you will see that the uh, the kind of spread that the media has in these countries does kind of emphasize that you know probably social media of a different kind. I mean, this probably for many of us might look as a very obvious, no big deal. Social media is the order of the day, but What is also important here is that the scholarship specifically wanted to also look at the soft power dimension because within ourselves there was a clear cut understanding that, for example, Russia and China uh, are very aggressive, almost parallel with their military or other power in media across the world. For example, the Sputnik network that Russia has come up with, replacing the earlier Novosti and other kind of publications that they had, and the CCTV China kind of approach. For example, even in the recent Indo-China, you could see multiple roaring voices from within the China, within India. But in case of China, if you even looked at the Global Times China analysis in terms of their politics, economics, it does seem to give an impression that there is some kind of a uniform perception of what the state thinks and what the people ought to think. And I'm not getting into judgment about is that democracy, etc. It's a complicated thing, but the fact remains that this is something that we have to recognize. Whereas, Dyer, who has emerged, as one of the important scholars, who is very profuse in his writings, defined soft power in terms of Bollywood, yoga, and Buddhism also. Now, this begs the question as to whether China and India, in terms of communication system rather than media system, should try to dip into a civilizational mode. Now, this civilizational mode also has a problem, particularly in the context of India. If the civilization is imbued with a certain amount of iniquity, certain amount of aberrations, how far do you go and what you take from it? But that's some kind of a dilemma that, for example, when I was working at some other project, why did India not have a transition to return culture? There are many explanations that come up as against Buddhism's and its wooden blocks and its transition to the evolution of the formative traditions of India. So you have, these kind of questions that come to your mind, particularly when you think of how should I compare, should I compare, and if I compare, what aspects should I be talking about? Now, the project, did map like any other project, and the first book was a kind of a stock taking, and the last book that they will mention is due for release in November or December. They have their own publication record in dynamics. So this is what happened in the course of our work, which was spread out at least more than 30 publications of different kinds and various panel and uh, conference discussion. So of course the legacy in the new media distinction was there. Then there was a question of ethics, which many scholars in our own network in the department have been working on. And of course, personally, I rooted for the journalism and mass communication education. And, this also has come up as some kind of, what should I say, publication where more than stock taking of the JMC education, we were more worried about what inputs are going into it and what are the dilemmas of the context in which we are providing the education. Now, in terms of the structure, the system and the structure, of course, the governance and regulation. Why I'm highlighting this is that that these were all kind of consciously pursued aspects within our respective countries, but also trying to look at whether there are certain elements of comparison that are possible. This, of course, is a table. Um, Now, as I said, it's not that we have not had formations in the past. For example, we had SARC and we had ASEAN. Now, in the case of SARC, we pursued the media system in terms of the so-called Aman Ki Asha kind of a thing, media as a bridge, and so on and so on. But SARC itself, given the axis of relationship between India and Pakistan, is kind of wobbling a bit. And in between, there were many, particularly in the context of the Xiamen BRICS summit. There was a whole question as to whether BRICS also would fall apart. But I have a feeling that the way the economic scholarship on BRICS is concerned, the banks and the strategic relations seem to be more important. And I've also already pointed out about the democracy. I don't know whether it's a kind of a variable that needs to be factored into account. Uh, Poverty and deprivation, for example, Daya, who celebrated soft power of India very aggressively, now in the latest IMCR paper, talks about whether the soft power is adequate compensation for the huge gaps that exist, not only in terms of economic, but in terms of gender, class, and other variables. Now, I, for example, try to attempt to the geopolitical balancing between NWICO and BRICS, and the language and the continuity of discussion seems to be the same, except that in NWICO, the orientation was more on information and communication system, whereas in BRICS, which I have written about 2 years ago, the media discourse or media as a variable is missing in all the agenda of the BRICS summit, except a report by the Observer Research Foundation, which talks about the media system as well. Uh, one author, there might be many others, which our friends might chip in, talks about how difficult it is to do the comparative system. Now, why do people do comparative study is a different matter. Many scholars say that for example, it's a kind of a very strong, it has strong funding aspects built into it. And then, of course, there are larger goals of improving understandings, testing theory, and so on. But while this is true, there is also the question of publishing and reporting the research findings in a comparative framework, where we, particularly in the Indian context, or probably my colleagues in the other Asian and Latin American context or the South American context, we have a lot of problems in terms of not necessarily the publishing scrutiny, but constantly trying to fit into and answer certain loaded terms, certain theoretical constructs, which historically and culturally many of us are not aware. So what happens in these kind of comparative studies is the end product might have considerable deviation in terms of the actual context. And that in itself becomes a critique. Once the work is published, then people would say that, oh my goodness, this has been left out, this has not been taken into account. The comparisons that researchers offer is how difficult it was to study the Walt Disney phenomenon. They also talk about the social conflict and also the ambition and achievement. And these are very few representative studies. And I'm sure that this kind of a comparative approach is evident in many other areas as well. Now, methodological preferences and research ethics. Now, this is something that, for example, the journalist survey had a lot of problem for the Indian team, that is myself, Vimula, and a few others. There are about almost 185 to 186 questions, and there was this question of do journalists have permission from their publishers? A whole lot of dynamics of it's a. For example, we believe in if I talk to somebody, I believe that somebody and me have a certain frame of understanding in why I'm asking certain questions and why the person is responding. I mean, we believe that. But no, the institutionalization of research has brought in many other variables, which at times I can tell you became a lot of problem. For example, I had to engage in more than 2 to 3 months, almost to the point of difference, about this whole question of what questions we could ask and what questions we could not ask. And there is a certain amount of assumption that the profession has certain aberrations. I mean, but no, the questions were that do you believe in it? What do you have to say? So, what I'm trying to say is that in comparison, the framework of research questions, people might say there are methodologies which say that you can adapt, students are aware, there's a structure, there's a schedule, etc. But no, but when you are doing it for a comparative and reporting, I think those issues become important. On the writing styles and publication strategies, I've already talked about. Publishing. I'm sure that the Indian scholarship is very much caught into the vortex of the API style, basket of journals, etc. And I don't want to comment more on it, except the fact that the critique that we receive to whatever we write seems to have a kind of a prolific North American and the Euro-centric perspective. It's not for its own sake that I'm pointing it out to you, but do you have an alternative? For example, Kinkled and others talked about the Eastern perspectives, and but Eastern perspectives also was very criticized because what they said was it's so philosophical in its nature that it thoroughly ignores the development of media system, which probably is a post-Renaissance modern kind of a situation. This again is something that I have talked about. Um, we are all aware of what imperatives limits the paradigm of modernization and development. For example, to repeat the scholarship of the Sham era, whether mass media and national development discourse was an attempt at comparison, attempt at comparison to infuse awareness and media into the system as a possible tool of development. We also have this, I call it as the spiral of advocacy, alternatives, and renegotiation. Because once we accept that the post facto system is there, then the responses begin to appear. But the system and the structure, have they changed or not, is something that we need to kind of, debate. One, of course, is the cloning of topics. I have examples of diffusion and user and gratification. units and categories for studies, which of course is a very long methodological discourse. I also pointed out earlier, are we kind of adjusting our definitions and description to a matrix? In this particular case, BRICS, and uh, the primordial factors. It's something that the more we talk about it, the more difficult it becomes. There are many other factors. For example, in the Indian context, where language affinities, class affinities, caste affinities, etc. Defining it in terms of limited notion of power, limited notion of economics, sometimes becomes problem. And within the media and how media agenda is driven, there are these variables as well. And what we can do is, at best, we can footnote it and talk about it. But a full-scale structure analysis may have to incorporate some of these aspects. Now, just to give you an example towards the end, uh, the structural analysis has not changed. This is the Media 2019 UNESCO report, where independence, freedom, pluralism, and safety of the journalists is a variable, and this is something that will drive the comparative studies for quite some time to come, I would say. And this is something about soft pass, where I can respond when the questions come. And we have traversed uh, a continuous academic space, uh, have agonized on many of this dilemma. At some point in time, I even thought that I will kind of not respond to some of the queries. For example, China, Russia, and partially Brazil, because of the law that they have with kind of journalists in the country, constantly number was, what is the number of media persons you have? My goodness, uh, I tried with the journalism federations, I tried with 70 and others. And finally, I had to work for more than 2 months and doing all kinds of analysis into government, economic reports, company report. I did come up with the number of media persons in India as about 49,000, 50,000. And I sent it across to media who, Seventy, who was at the foot, and she said that, my goodness, this is something that we have all not looked at. Not that the number is important, because when laying off journalists, etc., comes into picture, we don't seem to have. Whereas other countries seem to have fairly good account of who a journalist is, what they do, etc. Now, should we be like them, pointing out, tracking journalists or not, is a larger political question. Finally, the work has culminated in these. It's just not about media system and structure. Uh, the authors and the team has tried to negotiate it in 4 different chapters. My contribution is in terms of trying to understand what media system and structure in India is, which may not be very different from what the rest of the scholarship is talking about. But maybe I would have argued it a bit in terms of certain aspects of printing press, certain aspects of political economy, to add to my own understanding of the media system and structure. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm open to questions, suggestions, or even critique from any one of you. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much, sir. Your presentation focused on the approach and problems of studying the parameters and structures of comparative media systems. This forms an important part of the comparative communication research debate and furthers internationalization of media and communication studies. So, thank you so much for taking time out to talk to us about this. Um, so we'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. And I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB Live comment questions together. But I do have a special question from FB comments, which I'll ask you first. In the meantime, I request all the participants to raise their hands, and I will announce your names in order. You will find the raise hand option next to your username. Or please scroll down to the bottom of the screen to Zoom activity controls and click on participants. You will find the raise hand icon there below the participants username. If you can't raise your hand for any reason, please let me know that you would like to ask the question live, and I will invite you in. Please ensure that you send me your request via personal message. Kindly turn on your microphone and a video depending on your connection when it is your turn to ask. And please keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have maximum interaction. We will take questions starting now for the next 10 minutes only to manage time better. First of all, sir, I know I usually ask common questions later, but we have a question from Professor Sunil Behra, and I'm going to post it in the chat section as well. Sanjay, sir, if you could just tilt your laptop screen a little down below. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm just posting Sunil sir's question on chat. You can see it as well. He asks, Professor Sanjay, can you just elaborate on the governance and regulations of MCJ communication and research in the BRICS, Asia, and more importantly, India? Being a teacher and as a university administrator involved in teaching and policy making for the last 40 years, I'm sure you'll be able to review and give us a roadmap.
Yes. Yes. Am I audible, Devina?
Yes, perfect, sir.
Okay. Yes, Sunil. The regulation and the structure within the Indian context is what you're trying to ask. For example, you see the oldest kind of a the oldest kind of framework, as you know, was rooted in the war era and wanting to suit the needs of the British Empire then, and therefore information and broadcasting became a kind of a nodal ministry for affairs pertaining to both print and broadcasting country. For some reasons, when the transfer of power took place, the government of India felt that it was very convenient to retain that because it would give them the control over the system. But what has happened since post-emergency, the harsh critique of government having a say in many affairs, including for that matter, print, with regard to support, with regard to subsidy, with regard to advertising, etc., was that the so-called liberalization, the economic layering of liberalization, particularly in the media sector, while it advocated that hands off, but the regulation continues in terms of, for example, broadcasting cannot take place outside the framework of either the telecommunication regulation or the notion of uplinking and downlinking of channels. And now you have also the electronic media and monitoring cell, which on a daily basis monitors all the channels. So while apparently we seem to think that it is deregulated in terms of functioning, regulations are there in every sphere. For example, the Law Commission has pointed out more than 20 to 25 aspects of interference that is there in the media structure. last point that I would like to say is when information and broadcasting could not handle the contours of technology, around 2007-8, they transferred the contours of technology dimension to Telecommunication Regulatory Authority of India. Now, what has happened as a consequence is, even on the issue of ownership, where ASCII did a study in Hyderabad, TRI's observation on ownership um, is more acceptable to the government. And ASCII report, which had a little bit more details on advertising, etc., is so I would say that the state has a say, but apparently we tend to believe that the media sector is highly privatized and is working on its own dynamics. And today, if you see 11 English channels, it is A to Z what the powers that we want us to believe. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have a question from Preeti. If you could please unmute yourself and even come on video if that's possible, depending on your connection.
Yeah, my question is, firstly, it's methodological. I'd like to understand in conducting systemic or structural research, especially in the comparative context, how do we account for externalities, be it in the form of the diplomatic efforts that are ongoing or even uncertainties, especially in times like this? How do we account for these kind of externalities in a structural, systemic kind of research? And the second question is, in the face of big tech wars that are now defining geopolitics, do you see the BRICS as a site where this might play out? And if yes, how?
Yes, Preeti, thanks for the question. When we say, see, in the first place, to situate a media system as completely domestic is not what was intended as trying to define the context. Point number one. Two, whenever you talk about technology from the days of printing to satellites to computers, the externality of the technology, its manufacturers, its promoters, has always been the defining element of a media system anywhere in the world without any exception, including, for example, why did a particular set of countries accept CCAM as the television standard, and why certain countries accepted PAL as a standard. There is a lot of politics involved in terms of where these standards originated. Point number two, externalities as in terms of not necessarily diplomatic missions, which constantly feed the information about where is the favorable climate for the countries to move on. You would notice that particularly in the telecommunication sector, from a seven company system to almost a duopoly now is something that is a systematic influence that I would say of the economic factors. And lastly, from the era of the British broadcasting, you would notice that, I mean, I'm sure that you've done your work in community radio and other policies. In the 1931-32, much against the will of the then British government, it was Marconi Company which told the British government that the state should move into broadcasting because otherwise Marconi Company sales in the Indian colonial context will not be there. That is the reason why, despite its reluctance, the British state had to take this. So you are right. I mean, the systemic external impact and influences uh, cannot be ignored in trying to define, what should I say, a highly romanticized context that is completely autonomous. That is not possible at all, particularly in the media sector. Two, has BRICS been able to negotiate? Uh, Probably yes and no. For example, the South African scholarship in the team uh, talked about how the Chinese media uh, and its influence in the satellite and telecommunication developments pan Africa is so deeply entrenched that the so-called autonomous voices will be relegated to a few manifestations of cultural artifacts here and there. Um, in the case of Brazil, the externalities were controlled by a highly autocratic regime over a period of time. But the alliance Brazil had with USA allowed it to develop certain codification of the media systems. Now, in the Indian context, right from the days of broadcasting, which I'm sure that I have argued in many places, particularly satellite broadcasting, the externalities of the development of the technology and the systemic responses of deployment of technology, I think is a very important contextual variable. Thank you.
Preeti, I hope that answers your two questions. Yes. Sanjay sir, we have other questions, but there's a follow-up question from Sunil sir, and he's asking for a little more clarification on MCJ education and research governance and regulation.
Um, I know, Sunil, that it's something that we all, are increasingly agonized over it, but unable to do much about it. Um, Regulation in MCJ was at one particular point in time had consensus, some kind of a consensus through the UGC framework. Because UGC framework was in a position to have a say in the state and the central university system, we attempted many curricular approaches, including the much contested model curricular approaches, etc. But what has happened is the harsh critique of the state university education system that many a time we ourselves engaged in was a kind of a move towards vocationalizing. Now, when you move media education towards vocation, you have no other option but to fall prey to the changing contours of media practices and their constant absorption of technology. That is one of the reasons why you would see the proliferation of media education occurring in more in terms of media backed or media interested institutional frameworks. Now, is there a scope? Are we becoming despondent? I would not say no. I would not say that we have reached a kind of a end of the world. Probably university education system still has a lot of interest in terms of discourse, in terms of policy intervention, in terms of the rights, and so many other variables. So I would say that regulation is very loose, although the Press Council of India, did try to attempt. University of Pune was asked to do that. Now we heard that IIMC wants to set the standards, but that has also died a natural death. But I think, Sunil, given our autonomy, you, me, and many others who may be in the panel here have a kind of a valid justification in shaping MCI in an autonomous manner to make communication more meaningful.
Um, Thank you, sir. The next question is sort of an offshoot of our discussion, and it's by our PhD scholar Anirudh Jena. He asks if media and communication studies in India in general is under-theorized in social sciences and untheorized within media and communication studies. And as a result, scholarship has not been able to address and capture social realities in a more critical way because we lack a robust theoretical and methodological argument to be able to capture those essences. So, what is your take on that?
Yeah. Jenna, the first part of your question, I'm sure that you're all exposed to particularly the advanced PhD theoretical course that we offer in the department. One cannot escape the influence of the larger and the older social science theoretical traditions which have come into media and communication. To say that we have completely evolved our own theoretical frameworks, I think would be very naive. I mean, so there is a overarching social science traditions in which communication and media research is taking place. But the second part of your question as to whether we have been able to seize the contours of the larger social science research applicable to India in terms of our work in media and communication, I would say that we have not. What we have done is we have tried to be a bit clonish in terms of one of the slides I talked about, the North American and the Eurocentric one. So I don't want to use these terms in a very pejorative sense, Anirudh. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the influence is there. So I think the disconnect in India is more in us not being able to draw from applicable social science traditions within India that have questioned structures of power, that have questioned distribution of power, that have looked at identities, etc., and make it applicable to media and communication studies. But we are more into the discourses, concepts, and theories that are derived and are more because they are easily seen, Anirudh. I mean, they are easily seen in books, in journals, etc. It becomes a very kind of a handy tool for us to take into account. So you would have 2,400 diffusion studies. Who said that we could not have examined the structural limitation of diffusion studies even in 1950s and 60s? Nobody prevented us, but we didn't want to do it because there was a pressure. There was a pressure that that is the way to go. So the defining movements of research traditions and our lack of absorbing the macro social science traditions probably is the indictment of our discipline as of now, today.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think this is the reason why a lot of our scholars are extremely happy that there have been calls for decolonizing research, whether it's in social sciences broadly or communication and media research specifically. Sir, I'm afraid this is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and for entertaining questions.
I've also, Devyani, I've also, as you required, I've also given you a reading list. which
Yes.
for people who might, that is within the confines of the project, nothing very profound in terms of theory, but whatever we put some comparative. So whoever wants it, you could kindly share it with them.
Yes, we've shared the reading list as well as the link to the edited volume in chat here on Zoom as well as on Facebook as a comment. And people can look at the list. It's open for everyone to view and follow whichever papers interest them. Thank you so much, Sanjay sir.
Thank
Uh,
you.